Welcome, everybody, to a really exciting webinar. I want to tell you something about my guest today. After I tell you about the hoodie that I'm now wearing, this is a brand new VanillaSoft and Order Close hoodie. This is the first time I've worn it. It's very comfortable, perfect for hosting a webinar in. I'm ready to sit back and talk about sales trigger events with you. And I just mentioned my guest. That's because we've had him on a few times, and he's brought some special content with us today. So I'm excited to bring David Kreiger to the stage. How you doing, sir?
Very good. Good to have you, Ollie. Nice. That does look like a comfortable sweatshirt. So not good for maybe Florida weather right now, but yeah.
Yeah, I am a little bit warmer than I would like to be, but that's a me problem. And I've got my company name on one arm, and on the other arm, it's good. I'm happy to have this. So this is my excuse to not wear a blazer or a jacket. So I'm wearing my company, but good stuff. And good to have you back. So as we said, we're going to talk about trigger events. What the hell are those? How do we use them? To be honest, in my personal experience, anytime I've used a trigger event or not, it was the difference between me landing or not landing with my message, with booking a meeting, whatever I was trying to do. Point blank. It's pretty much as simple as that. If I got it wrong or if I didn't, no chance. Trigger events are super, super, super important. So we're going to go through 4 that we think are particularly important. Before we do that, I have to do 2 very quick bits of groundwork. If you're watching this live, you'll get the recording tomorrow. Don't worry about it. We always get asked. I kind of have to say. And if you're not watching this live, don't worry. You can share this wherever you'd like to. Put it on your personal Facebook post or LinkedIn. Share it to your grandparents if you want to. All good. Do what you want. Now, that's the main thing that I have to get out of the way. And now we can get on with the fun stuff. So, Mr. Kreiger, what does a trigger event mean to you?
Yeah, so it is being able to reach out to a prospect at the moment that they might need your product or service. So a lot of cold outreach throughout history has been kind of like, hoping, hoping that somebody is in the right buying window, in the right mindset for your product or service. And I'll be honest, right now, it still is a lot. And there is an aspect that you need for your outbound for that. But where you can, if you can actually reach out to a prospect during a point in either their job transition, in their company's transition, and actually have something to offer them that's going to solve a potential pain or issue that they're having right now, the chances of your success in that sales process jump significantly. And with the tools that are out there, we're in a unique time where we can really be able to leverage these trigger events in ways that we haven't before. And so that is, exciting and really an important part to build into somebody's outbound process if they haven't already.
One of the very first things that you said about that really stuck out to me. Most of the time, people think of a trigger event as something that they are finding for them, not the trigger of a reason to buy. So for instance, it could be, we'll get onto several examples here, but you could find a LinkedIn post that I wrote if I'm your prospect. Does that mean I'm any more reason to buy than yesterday or the day before? Not really, unless I say something particular in that content. But it's easy to find if you're the sales rep. And that's what a lot of people do. They go for, what can I find? How can I get this? Process-wise, not what is an indication of buying intent or anything in that kind of landscape. So I'm with you there. Now, I know that you've got, sorry, go on.
Just to build on that, and we'll talk about this, LinkedIn is a great place to find trigger events, but you have to be looking for the right thing. It's not necessarily just a generic post, but like you said, within some of those posts or within some of the things that might be announced on LinkedIn, something that is of real triggering, so a real pain or something that has changed in either their life or their company's life that will indicate a potential opening and need for you to be able to help them. And so absolutely, and we'll talk about LinkedIn, that's going to be very helpful and is really helpful, but you've got to, and we'll talk about this in the structure as well, you've got to know what a trigger event really is for your company.
Yeah, and there'll be a lot of them that other people use, which are easy or sound really clever, but even if the best one to you is really hard to work out and hard to get, best find out a way to get it, because if it's going to work, do that. So I know that you've got a little something you want to share with us for a few minutes. Is that right?
framework that we use to think about trigger events and for our team to think about trigger events. And so I'd like to walk through that just before we go into a few examples. Just as a framework, I think as people either, if they've tried to use trigger events and they haven't worked, or they're thinking about it right now, it's a way for them to think about how to get trigger events to work for them, their SDRs, their companies.
Okay, awesome. You want to walk us through it then?
Yeah, absolutely. And so basically,
so what's it called before we get started off? What's have you got a cool name for this? We're marketers as well. What's the name here?
So we found that there are really 6 key steps for having what we call impact with trigger events. And yes, that is an acronym. So here it goes. It is impact. And we have defined each of these steps to help our team remember how to do this properly. So I is, identify potential trigger events. M is monitor for trigger events. P, pursue promptly. A, align messaging. C, connect. T, test and learn, right? So every great process has to have a little bit of a cheesy acronym, but it really does work and helps to really think about these in the right way. So let me go through each one. So identify potential trigger events. So as we talked about, Ollie, you've got to think about what are the right trigger events for you. And we're going to talk about some general ones that everybody can use, but I really encourage people to think about trigger events that are specific for that company and for your product or service. So for instance, if you're in construction and you can get data on, permits that are not even permits, but design plans from architects, or maybe a city is starting to think about building a new stadium and things like that. Whatever is specific for your product or service is going to be that much more of a trigger event. So you really got to spend time on this first step and identify what are those potential trigger events. Now, there are common ones, and we'll talk about some of those so that it's wide for everybody. Changes in job positions, company expansions, funding rounds, new hires, those types of things, even, spikes in website traffic around certain pages. And we're even going to talk, about demo requests, which is like, a real near-in trigger event, right? So really think about what are those trigger events for you and your organization. Second, you've got to set up a system or a process for your team to monitor the trigger events. And we'll talk about some of these. People like to use Google Alerts. I personally, we like to use Sales Navigator a lot for this. And then there's some really good tools that have been coming out. I'll talk a little bit about a company called Clay that is great to set this up. But you've got to have a process where you can regularly be checking for these trigger events and know about them. And so, because if you don't know about them, you can't act on them. And the third step is pursue promptly. If you wait around for a trigger event, or, you can leverage trigger events in a way by pulling lists, and if there was a funding round, or even looking in the last 12 months, but the longer a trigger event goes without your team pursuing it promptly, the less of an impact you're going to have, because either they might move past it, they might have already solved it already, right? Or somebody got there first. You weren't able to have that conversation with them. You weren't able to become the trusted partner to help them during that period of time. So speed to trigger, we talked about speed to lead, right? Speed to trigger is really, really important. Then you've got to align your messaging. You can't go after a trigger event and then just have your regular cadence and go after it and say, okay, they're in that mindset, but I'm just going to talk about me and talk about my product or service. You've got to think about what that trigger event means to them. What pain or opportunity for them did that trigger create? And how do you fit into that? And, giving that some thought and thinking about the messaging so you can really relate to them is important, because if you come in with a generic message, they might be having the trigger event, but they might not be able to connect the dots and see how you can help them with that issue. Or what's happening. And so really thinking about the messaging and not just using it as a way to create a new lead list is truly important. To that end, and I break this out separately because I think it's really important in general selling, but even more so, I think, in trigger events, is use the trigger event as an opportunity to connect with that prospect, build a relationship, and not just to sell. If you've got the right trigger event, they've got some pain, they've got some issue. And so don't rush the process. Don't go straight to selling, asking for demos, even asking for an appointment to show them your product or service. Use it as a way to empathize with them and offer some ways that you can be helpful to them as a salesperson, as an individual. And we'll talk about what that looked like in a bit. And then lastly, like with everything, you got to test and learn. Always look at what's working. What are the trigger events? Which trigger events are working for you? Which ones maybe just fall flat? What type of messaging is working? And continue to iterate over time. And that is how we at SalesRoads handle trigger events with impact.
I've got to tell you, the visuals were beautiful. And if I'm not mistaken, the bottom left-hand corner of our screen, what we're seeing there, that's your LinkedIn handle where I can probably see this and other similar frameworks, right? Is that a little...
Absolutely.
Is that
We're
true?
trying to produce content all the time to help people out, think about outbound, think about strategies, talk about the things that we're doing and we're testing. So absolutely.
Good stuff. Yeah, I like the graphics. These kind of sliders are really popular at the moment. And if you don't already follow David Kreiger, I think that you probably should.
Appreciate that.
All right. Nicely walked through. Thank you very much for that. So I think if we're ready, actually, there was something I wanted to bring up there. One of the things that stood out a little bit there, quick observation, I don't know how intentional this was. Oftentimes, if you're thinking about what trigger event should I look for in my market, and then you cast the net and you go after what you see. We don't often really consider it, or we don't often practice the idea of kind of waiting for it to happen as well. So in the sense of Google Alerts or LinkedIn Sales Navigator, you go up and you see and you have a list there, and that's it. That's what you've got to work with. But there's not necessarily the thinking of, and the way that you'd framed this kind of told me that you could maybe have accounts who aren't hitting that trigger event now, but they might in the future. And that doesn't mean you can't reach out. It doesn't mean that you have to, but it just means you kind of got to reserve that messaging for another point. And that was the main thing as well, where oftentimes you just get congrats on the funding or whatever the trigger event was. Insert completely unrelated context that doesn't sound stitched together at all. It could be two totally separate conversations, which I'll say from having read several of them, they sound really jarring. And it doesn't work that well. So just a couple of things that came out to me.
Yeah, and it can, you're right, it can put people off if you're just being templated, because also a lot, especially with some of the ones we're going to talk about today, because they're more common, other people are going to be reaching out, right? And so there is going to be a funding event. A lot of especially the higher level folks, they're going to get inundated at that point. So you've got to make sure, first of all, speed matters, because a lot of times people will be late to it, but then having that right messaging and really connecting and not selling in those situations, and showing them not just a congrats and a thumbs up that you got the funding, but why you understand some of the things that you've been going through. You've had clients that have gone through some of those things, and you'd like to be a resource to help them during that period of time to solve X, Y, and Z.
So I think our brains are both on the same page here. We both have said the word funding a couple of times. So, and I know that our first point to go through, our first trigger event, is funding news or announcement of funding of any kind. So, so talk to me from the very beginning. How are you going to find this type of information? Are there certain sources that you like to go to, and then from there, what kinds of things do you try to say in relation to that funding round in your trigger event?
Yeah, so I think with most trigger events, the best place to start is with Sales Navigator. And it's not with the build a list in Sales Navigator and who has gotten funding in the last 12 months. Though it can be helpful if you want to get a start, that's fine, but you're going to not get the pursue promptly portion of that, right? A person might have raised 11 months ago, right? And a lot of those things that you've solved. So I think it's really important, if you haven't done so already, you got to start with Sales Navigator and building, obviously, your lists in Sales Navigator of those types of companies that you think are your ICP, if you want to build it as broadly as as you can, because obviously these trigger events don't come up all that often. So depending on how many people that, and accounts you are managing, you got to build that in there. And then on a daily basis, you've got to look for those notifications, right? Because it will come up. One of the alert, make sure the alert is set, right? That, for funding events and things like that, it is going to come up in the feed, right? And then you know that trigger happened. You can see how they're positioning it. You can go into it and you can start researching it. And so Navigator is a non-negotiable, in my opinion, for really monitoring trigger events. You can build things, and I know for a long time people built things in Google Alerts, and that's okay. You can get a notification if you want to build it up and put your TAM in there and use some software, that's fine. What we found recently is a partner called Clay, which is just an amazing tool. And what we do is we build our full TAM, really, as well as our ICP in there for all those accounts. And then it can scrape LinkedIn and other types of sources. And then either, if you want, and I don't recommend this, but you can automate some of the emails when things come out, or it can then really notify you. But you are really building that, and that can be linked with your CRM, and you've got your whole list, and it can trigger that and then also scrape some of the different resources for you to summarize some of the things that maybe were put in the press release for the funding. Maybe some other LinkedIn things, and then you can aggregate and have a good base of information for you to be able to customize your email, which we'll talk about.
So the bit that you mentioned there just at the end about customizing what's said, taking words from the press release, if presuming that there is one, is I personally think is the main thing where, like, I would say PAR is referencing that there's funding, or if it's a big funding round, you might be able to extrapolate some information from that and reference that in your messaging. But it's fairly rare that I have seen they've thoroughly read the press release and have identified a particular initiative said by a particular person of seniority. It's going to be a senior person, isn't it? It's never that well laid out. And it's almost bulletproof when you're saying someone else's words and crediting them for saying it in the email that you're posing to that person, which I think is a really underutilized thing. I think Jen Allen was talking about that on one of our shows before. It's kind of say what their boss is saying because they've heard the words and they're in charge of doing it. So at least you've taken away I don't want to deal with that. It's not on my plate. We know it is probably the most underutilized thing I think I've seen about that.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's great. And being able to reference it and just get in the mindset of their senior team and why they took this money and what some of the goals are. Is it a growth capital round? Are they investing in product? Those types of things. Whatever. Maybe they're expanding to new countries, and that's a reason for you. Maybe you're an international payroll provider. Whatever it might be, looking and really understanding from their voice, what is it? And then the other part is you've got to know, because some of this stuff won't be in the press release, but you've got to understand your personas, right? And understand when these things happen, even if it's not said in the press release, what are they probably feeling? So I'll give an example for SalesRoads, for instance. So we work with a lot of companies who just took some growth capital. They've figured out who they think their target market is. They have a product or a service that is working, and they're really looking to build out their sales team and their SDR team. And one option for them is to really manage their AEs and build out their SDR team through a partner like us. So they're not having to worry about it because we can move quickly. We understand how to do it. So we then think about, right, if they already have a CRO, or if they have a VP of sales, or if it's just a president at that point, what are some of the pressures that they're going to be feeling in that moment of taking that growth capital from their VCs? And it's pretty obvious, right? It's they got to grow their sales, right? And they are sweating. They don't know how to build an SDR team necessarily. They maybe they have maybe a leader who knows who they want to focus on AEs and whatnot. And so you got to put yourself in that mindset. And if you understand your personas, you can then, even if it's not put in the press release, there's some of those specific statements, you want to then relate to them in the email. And empathize with some of the pressure they might be feeling, some of the goals they might be feeling. And then lastly, offer a way to help that is short of buy my service to help you, right? And so for us, and again, there's lots of ways you can do it, but for us, there's two ways that I think are effective. One is just offering to do a strategy call around sales development and some of the things that they have had, might be struggling with, some of the things we've seen with other companies that have raised a Series A or Series B or whatnot, and would love to talk to them about that and just give some best practice and talk through some of the issues. And then the second part is if you have some form of content that is helpful for them, but it has to be helpful in the context of the trigger event. It can't just be your latest white paper. We just did a white paper on employee retention and SDR retention. If I send that as a trigger event, to somebody who just raised funding, it's like, I'm not going to click on this, right? We've all seen people trying to be helpful with content that's not relevant. You got to make sure it's content that's relevant to where they are in that moment. And that's another good thing to offer if you even want to, go short of even offering to do a strategy call or something like that. So those are some of the things I think are helpful in aligning the messaging when you are reaching out with a trigger.
As you were saying that, I was thinking, what content would you send them in follow up to that? And it's, as you said, so often we just send like, oh, we've got this ebook, let's send them that. But, oftentimes as well, when people mention other companies that they've worked with who are meant to be social proof, they're not anything alike that company. If you're doing a funding news trigger event and you're going to do that reference of another company that's your client, they must be funded and look like that company you're reaching out to. So again, ideal world, if you have a case study of that and it references at least fairly obviously, Acme Inc. funded, got 20 mil, then it's, you can resonate and draw the lines there. But you definitely couldn't do that if you're just going to go like, here's VanillaSoft, they're our client. VanillaSoft isn't funded. It doesn't make any sense to do that. So that's the main one there, I think. And often the tone is the really big differentiator in this type of thing. It's very easy to be deadpan and go, hey, David, congratulations on your funding. Insert messaging. And that's so deadpan and it doesn't lend itself to sounding like you've really researched this and looked at it and thought about it and you have a question and you have insight, because people who have that don't sound like that. So often at the end, you might be able to say, if you've come across with that really thoughtful angle and lens, your call to action doesn't even have to be like, do you have 30 minutes on Tuesday? It could just be, where did I go wrong with some of that? And, how's it going? Or something fairly light or like conversational in a sense, because you don't need to go full board right off the bat.
Yeah. And I would recommend in a trigger event, especially like the one we're talking about, like funding or we'll talk about job changes, which is another one that a lot of companies can use. But they're also, you have to remember where they are. If they just got funding or they just changed up, they are super busy and they're going to be very selective of meetings. So you've got to be careful of asking it too soon. And that's why that connect part, you've got to build that connection with them first. And so pursue promptly, get in front of them quickly, but don't close promptly, right?
Yeah, particularly with funding and our next one, job changes. I think with the promptly, you've got to be razor sharp with this, because as soon as anyone gets funding, if it's anything big as well, this is amplify this by 10. You're one of like a lot of people who are saying, hi, congratulations on your funding and something. So if you can say it in any better way than the really bland words I just said, that's at least 1% better. And that means a world of difference in amongst that many more emails that they're already dealing with and the projects and the stress and the other things.
Yeah. And just I've said this already, but I think it's important on that point. We're going over 4 ones that we thought could apply to a lot of people, because, there's going to be a lot of different people on here, but that step, and that's why it's the first one, is identify potential trigger events. It's fine to use these, right? Because they're still good. We find that they work, but the more niche you can get with your trigger event for your particular product or service that can help your target prospects, the less competition you're going to have. So really don't skip that first step and use these that we're talking about. Doesn't hurt. These are all good. But they are general that everybody can use. And if there's something specific for your industry that can be helpful, I encourage you to lean into that.
All right. So on the topic of Sales Navigator, because that's going to be part of your funding round tracking, I'm guessing our next topic is going to be something similar. So changing of jobs, that type of thing. When your customer leaves from the company they're with, and you think it's worth following them to their next job, maybe there's a reason for them to bring you in. They already know you. They already like you. They already understand the benefit. I'm going to guess that you're going to say track them in Sales Navigator, maybe track the champion and the decision maker. But that's just me guessing at where you're going to go. Am I wrong? Am I right? Something in the middle?
You are. I'm going to add to it. So the two ways that we find that are easiest. So I'm going to repeat those for this as well. And you can set these up the way you have, and maybe you have certain things, you're really good at Google, whatnot. So figure out how you want to do it. But I'll just tell you how we like to do it. So absolutely Sales Navigator. It's still you. And what we do is, we're following absolutely the champion. We follow everybody that we're interacting with, to be honest with, because we've had AEs that go to different companies and say, listen, you've got to bring SalesRoads in, right? So the more that of them, it doesn't have to be title specific. It's somebody you're interacting with. It could be one of our clients. We work very closely with their VP of analytics. That's fine, right? So anyone who can be a champion, who knows the quality of the work, that you've built that trust, I would make sure that you're following them. So we have lists both for our current clients. We have lists for our past clients. We have lists also for proposals, and we'll talk about that in a minute. There are times that either you went to the end, and maybe somebody really wanted to work with you. We've had that, and they just didn't. Their funding got pulled, right? And so when they go someplace else, maybe they'll have funding. So the more people you can follow where you built that trust, that relationship, the better. So I would not be discriminatory in who you're following and connecting on LinkedIn, because again, these trigger events don't always happen all the time, right? So you need to cast a wide net to be able to have them coming up in your feed with some regularity.
I've got a question about that then. Apologies for complicating this, but let's say you've got a fairly large team, and you've also got, hopefully with that, a fairly large number of customers, and over time that list of people who move around a couple of times, it becomes exponentially bigger as you go. How do you sort of divide that up? Because the last thing you want, at least I'm imagining this as we go, is every rep tracking everyone, because obviously there's certain territories or maybe you do mid-market and enterprise split ups, but you're certainly going to have enough people to make a division between, David gets this number of X customers and leads and that type of thing to track. And then if David happens to leave for any point, because sales reps sometimes leave, we give that to the new person. Or how do you kind of deal with all of that? Because it's going to get bigger than the net of just a few people, isn't it?
Yeah, so great question. It's dependent on the relationship, right? So each salesperson's tracking the leads that they worked, that they closed, right? And then that is their group. Now, if somebody, we're lucky, we have a very long longevity within our organization, so we actually haven't. But you're absolutely right. A lot of larger organizations, the AEs might change, they might move. So then you would just assign those over and just make sure you're tracking it and move it to somebody else. So that is a really good point. But it's dependent. It's better used when you as a person have also that relationship with that prospect. It is good when they have a relationship with the company. You don't want to lose those to that point if an AE leaves. But that relationship is really, really helps.
Yeah, I've seen it before where I've been reached out to reconnect with tools that were used before I joined this company, and it's kind of, I had no grounds to feel anything about it. It was sort of a moot point to me. So for that reason, I didn't quite get it. But that may still work pretty well. I think that's just sort of part of the percentage. And then on the flip side, I've had people come back to me where I'd used their tool before. Potentially, I wasn't the right person for them to do that with. I wasn't sort of influential enough in the purchase, but I was a user, and they were seeing if there was reason to bring them across as a user.
Yeah.
Which again, playing the percentages, that could well work. If I was a super fan, yeah, I'll advocate. I didn't think it was amazing, so I didn't. But I've seen both work a little bit.
Yeah. So I want to add on to this just a little bit, because I think it's the current clients, right? But I also have seen it work in the sales process, as I mentioned. And I just want to crystallize a few reasons why this is important and it works. One is they know you. We talk a lot about AI nowadays, but sales is still a human to human process, and that trust is really important. You build trust in the sales process. When they're a current client, they understand that the value you can bring, right? So it's not, and that's why this is an important trigger. The other aspect of this, and I think that people probably realize, is that when you move to a new company, those first, especially for us in like sales, but anyone, those first 90 days are critical, right? So they want to lean on vendors they know that can help them hit the ground running. And so being able to, and they've got a lot of demands on them, and they usually, if they're higher up, have some budget to spend at that point, and they're given the trust to make decisions more autonomously. So when you can get in front of somebody who has moved jobs recently, hopefully they've worked with you in the past, but also it's good to track this just in general. It's not as high of a close rate, but if they've moved jobs, they are in a better buying position because they have budget, they have some more authority, they were brought in to do a job, and they need to do it quickly. So that's another reason why a lot of companies lean on this trigger event. It's a good trigger event. But I'm going to give a little asterisk to this trigger event too, which I think is sort of bonus points. And I haven't found a great way to automatically track this. I'm working on it, trying to figure out some AI ways to screen pictures in LinkedIn and things like that. But unless you have a Sales Navigator recruiting license for yourself. But the best trigger event I've found is when somebody becomes open to work and they haven't settled yet on a job. And when you can help them during that process, first of all, it feels good, right? And you should do it for the right reasons. But I'll tell you, it also is great for your sales process, because we've had, just in Q1, there were two companies, and it was actually the same person that I helped. Or even tried to help. I didn't actually help him find a position, but it was somebody that he actually went with a competitor last year. I kept in touch because we track it, right? And I know that he had not a great experience with that competitor. But at that point, and this happens a lot, we're like, okay, so outsourcing, we've spent our budget, keep in touch. So, and he switched to open to work, and I reached out and said, is there any way I can help? Not just like look through my LinkedIn, and things like that, but could I have a conversation, look for what you're looking for, and see if I can make some connections. And we had a conversation. I made a few connections. He actually didn't end up finding a job through those, but he knew that I was legitimately trying, and he had some conversations and interviews because of that. And then he brought us in for both his company, and it was part of a conglomerate for another company. Because I built trust through that process. So I haven't found a great way, except for just seeing it, to track it. I'm looking for ways to be able to get pinged with that, because first of all, it's a great thing to do. We all want to help people in our network. But I'll say it is a pre-trigger event, and pursue promptly, right? So if you can get in even earlier and help somebody, that trust and relationship you're building, and really that connection you're building, is amazingly strong.
I'd like to publicly state my 10% claim to any future SalesRoads products, because it was first announced here that David might be creating some sort of AI recruiter. There's got to be
some way to look at it without, or I just got to buy the recruiter license.
That's smart. But yeah, you're putting yourself top of mind for good reasons, because you know what? They're nice people. I'm sure they'll treat me properly and straight. I'll go and ask them first.
Yeah.
And then
you build that relationship. So that's just a little bit of a bonus point. I haven't found a great way to automate it, but just look at it. You see it all the time, and just reach out to help people. Nothing comes of it. It feels good to help them.
So before we move on, I'm watching the clock a little bit. How do you say that in an email? Congrats for moving jobs. Again, it's like the funding round thing. It kind of sounds very cliche and static, but I guess it depends on how well you know them. I could, if you move jobs, I would just put, David, how's it going at place? Because we know each other pretty well. If it was a long time ago we spoke and you kind of signed the contracts and then we didn't talk too much, I'd be a little bit more formal, and it sounds a bit like what I said a second ago. So I imagine there's a little bit of that, but assuming the second scenario, that's probably a little bit more common. How do you approach it?
Yeah, so I try to stay away from too much of a generic first line, because a lot of other people are going to be saying that. But I try to get in as quickly as possible on some form of empathy. So if I'm going to say it's great you change jobs, I'm sure that is really exciting. But also I know the first few months can be a bit daunting. And so I just want to reach out. I know you're probably busy, right now getting up to speed, but I'm happy if you're part of that is thinking about sales development. If we've worked with the past before, we can talk about, some of the things we did and how it might apply here, or just, we have a client in this area. I can talk to you about some best practices, but I just wanted to be a resource during this period of time. So something to that effect, or if you have content, like a good content piece for something like this is, if it's maybe, I'll just use an example for us, like for a CRO, first 90 days, and 5 ways to build out your sales development department or to build out sales development, right? So something that is relevant for them during that period of time that could be helpful, but isn't overly pushy.
Got you. Yeah. Well, I got from that is a little bit of a pre-discovery discovery. Not even the discovery of is it worth doing something with us, but where are you? What would a good next step look like in any situation? That type of thing, just based on what you see in the people you work with, because it's hopefully them, but they look similar.
Yeah, exactly. And then also with the cadence too, a few things too. You want to be not overbearing during this period of time, but you do need to reach out a few times. They're busy, right? So we like to send an email and make a call at the beginning and just leave a message, not a pressure type of thing. And then for these types of things like a funding or with a job change, usually having, always with any cadence, minimum of 8 touches, but for this, you don't want to inundate. So over 4 to 8 weeks, you can think about what, and you can test what works for you guys. But one and done doesn't necessarily work here because they're busy and you got to stay in front of them. But again, in a way that you're connecting, not selling.
Totally. Yeah. All about the cadence. Is the one and done. It means your odds are like fractional. Yeah. So big believer in the cadence. All right. So I'm watching the clock a little bit. We have 2 more topics, but I think if you're watching this live somewhere, wherever you may be, shoot me an email if you want to see us go over some other topics as well, other trigger events. We will do it. We'll have a good time doing it as well. And if you're watching this on demand, whether it be on YouTube or somewhere else, leave a comment or at me, tell me, hey, what about this one? And I'll take that all the same. But our third one for today is the high intent inquiry. So for instance, that could be a contact us. They could be a demo request. If you have a demo, it could be a book a time to talk, book a consultation, book a discovery call, as we call it in sales, that type of thing. Fairly low down the funnel. This is like a good lead.
Yeah.
It sounds a bit bizarre, but what do you do with this? Because I think we overcomplicate this a little bit.
Yeah, or sometimes people don't think about it. They might get into, and the reason why I thought that was an interesting one, for you to bring up is people think about triggers as like all these things that we've talked about before, more complicated, but then they might not think as much about what is a real trigger, which is they actually raise their hand and say, I want a demo, right? And so you got to think about those, right? And most companies do have a good process, but if you don't, start there, right? You've got to make sure that you've thought about the most high intent trigger of all, which is somebody raising their hand, right? And so every company is different here, and I'll talk a little bit about what we do at SalesRoads. But the first thing we do, we get a lot of leads coming in. A lot of companies that want to or are interested about building their sales development, interested about doing lead generation, interested with appointment setting. But we do have a fairly tight ICP of companies that really can benefit from the type of sales development, the way that we integrate ourselves into our clients' infrastructure. And so what I would say with this trigger is you got to first think about, do you just want to handle every lead? And do you have the sales capacity to do it? Is every lead just something you want to be able to handle? Or even with these high value, or not high value, but high intent triggers, do you need to do some form of qualification? And so for us, just because of the number of leads, we do some form of pre-qualification. And then we have a different, and it's really 3 buckets. And then we have a different type of cadence for each, depending on how we've scored even that high intent lead, just because we know certain companies aren't going to be a good fit. And so with the ones first that aren't a good fit, if you do go that route and you don't want to, it is good to have some type of value to present to them, because people get annoyed if you basically say, we're not the right fit for you. And they're like, I want to potentially buy your service. So we've actually created, a relationship with a few other companies like ours that we think could be helpful to them. And so we write a helpful email saying, listen, here are some companies that really do help in your industry. We would recommend, you reach out. If you do have some questions or you think this is not accurate, let us know. But we try to point them in the right direction. On the flip side, on the high value, that is where we do a few different things. First, and you can do, if you're fielding all leads, I would just send an automatic email out. We don't, because we do want to score them to some degree, and that does take a little bit of human curation. We're still very quick. We get back to them quickly, but we will send an email that thanks them for their inquiry, has an easy way for them to book the initial discovery call, and builds a little bit of value in what we do for them. So if it's a high value lead, we customize it. Maybe we even send them, as part of it. Maybe you've seen this case study here. Here are some things. So really customize those high value leads. Maybe do even a little research, because that first touch, when you think about people evaluating you in your sales process, they evaluate everything. They're not just going to evaluate the discovery call. They're not just going to evaluate the demo. They're going to evaluate the first touch. Is it something that's building value? Especially for us, we're a sales development company, right? So we kind of got to practice what we preach. So make sure that first touch, especially for the high value, is even a little customized, and you're providing some value as to why they should convert, and then call them. You got to call them. You can't just, especially for the high value ones, you got to reach out and talk to them about how, booking that discovery call. And then the middle of the road ones, we template more. And then we'll just send out, we'll book a call, but we don't spend as much time on. So that's how we handle that initial. And then we have a cadence based upon that. Again, 8 touches is just sort of our standard. That is sped up because it is speed to lead. That isn't a trigger event. So we'll usually do 8 touches over 2 to 3 weeks, really, really fast, because it's high intent. Usually they book within the first 1 or 2 touches, but we want to be on them just because they did raise their hand.
Good stuff. Yeah, I was just thinking as you said that, you have to get on the phone. I firmly believe that you can templatize and automate some of the, if you would like to book a demo, for example, well, here's the calendar where we could book it. That makes sense, because we don't necessarily need a human to do that. But for a lot of these things, and as you said, when you have a bit of volume and you're interested in qualification as well, we're dealing with that at the moment too. There's the argument where we could have a calendar to just allow you to book, but then we get overrun by people who are maybe not fit, or they're looking for something a bit different. And like you said, we can recommend other people or other services that would be the better fit for them. Not having that calendar booking is optimal for us, but it does mean, and one of my favorite things about it means, you have to get on the phone. And when you pick up the phone, you say, hey, David, I'm calling from VanillaSoft. It sounds like you submitted a contact us request. Does that sound familiar? Because if so, I have 2 very quick things I wanted to ask you. And when you say, oh, yeah, of course, I did that yesterday, I say something like, I just wanted to ask, what was it that I could help you with? And I've completely forgotten the second question, but at least to get the first bit of information, what was it? And then you be quiet and you let them tell you, oh, well, here's everything that you couldn't know, and here's all of the backhand stuff that happened offline that you'll never know about, and here's the reasons why and what I saw and what I'm looking for as a next step. And then you're good. You don't even have to try and ask, hey, would you be interested in maybe having a 30-minute demo? And then from there, you just book it. But beyond that, I don't think you don't have to overcomplicate that. It's just ask and hear what they say.
Yeah, I love that. We've said, and so I think the second question is there any reason you reached out to SalesRoads or VanillaSoft in particular just to understand their mindset? What was it? Were they referred from somebody, right? Was there something they heard about us, or was it just general? So you can leverage that. So that's important. And then one other thing I realized I forgot to mention the process, and it feeds into the first two that we talked about, is both connect with that prospect on LinkedIn and put them into your proposal or inbound lead list for that point. Because again, I think if they're high target, if they're not that qualified, I really am a firm believer that you got to build that, especially if you're going to see some of the other trigger events and be able to keep in touch with a lot of people in your TAM.
All right, so we've got 4 or 5 minutes to go. I want to try and do 2 minutes on our last and our skinniest topic, and then I want to ask where people can follow you, and then we're going to end up, and I want to grab you for 2 seconds after we're done as well, if that's all right. Sure. So the content download. Now, this may not be for everybody, but there's a time and a place, and certain companies will do this, and at certain points they'll swap away from this model. But for some people, they will be experiencing this. Let's say you download a white paper, an ebook, you register for a webinar, and the sales rep receives the list. They reach out to those people. What can you say apart from referencing, hey, you saw the X, or you watched the Y, or you looked at the Z? What else can you do there? Is the flavor kind of, like we said a moment ago, just sort of asking for why, or should you go a bit more forthright and treat it as sort of like a little bit more automated? What do you think?
So I think with those in two things. One, on the content, and we don't do a lot of like gated content, and so that's harder. So you have to make that choice whether you're going to do the gated content with this or not. But with the webinar list, there's a few things I think that are important principles. One is scoring the leads and seeing which are the more high value leads, because for the most part, there's a lot of people who are going to be on the webinars, and there's only going to be a few that are really in your ICP potentially, right? And so to do this well, you want to be careful of just blasting everybody, because you're going to burn some of the really good ones, right? And so with those really good ones, then I would either, it's best if you're following upon a webinar, to watch the webinar. If not, at least get your marketing team to give you some of the key takeaways, right? So what they both were looking for, what are the pain points that it solves, and then how your product or solution can help them with that, right? And then for the webinar, it's always great to be able to reach out and say, you watched something on trigger events, right? Just was curious, if there are certain types of things you guys are currently doing around trigger events that are working or not working, or if you wanted to, brainstorm around some of the questions that you might have coming out of the webinar on how to execute and maybe set up your sales navigator on trigger events, right? So the more specific you can be about some of the things that were either covered in the webinar or the pain points that are being addressed, and reference that in your follow-up, the better.
All right, Dave, we are unfortunately out of time. It's my job to say that every time. I hate saying it. I always want these to carry on for like another hour, but I have to be the voice of sadness on this. So thanks very much for your time. This was awesome. Before you go, I want to make sure that everybody here knows where they can find you and follow you and find out about what you do. So can you let them know for us? Where can they find you?
Yeah, no, thanks. Well, so no surprise, I'm on LinkedIn, active there. So just, back to David Kreiger, with a funky spelling of my name with the EI. And then just, I'm president of SalesRoads. So you can look us up there. But, reach out on LinkedIn if you have any questions about the webinar, about trigger events, DM me. Happy to set up some time and go over any questions you might have.
There you go. And if you want to be an A1 webinar watcher, send David a message which uses the webinar as a trigger event and ask him to tell you how well you used it. But all right. Well, thanks very much for your time again, David, as I said. And if you made it to this far in the webinar, good for you. I respect your attention span. You're better than me. I'm kind of all over the place with this type of stuff. You can tell I'm looking here, I'm looking there. It's a struggle, but well done for lasting this long. Thanks very much. As I said at the very start, if you're watching live, there'll be a recording. Watch out for that tomorrow. Share it with whoever you'd like. And if you would like the slide deck, it's a pretty cool one, but we can send that to you as well. Heads up, you'll be receiving a few emails from us. We're going to send you a bunch of content after this. I'm going to record a little video giving you a bonus tip in a minute. And that's kind of all you need to know. So I hope you enjoyed the show, everyone, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you.